Anyone who's been paying attention has probably picked up on the fact that many of the topics and discussions that have been had in the Manosphere for the better part of a decade plus are now fair game for the mainstream, or at least semi-mainstream. Podcasts talk about evolutionary psychology. They talk about what's been referred to as the mating crisis, and so on and so forth. And so it's not exactly taboo to address these things per se, but I always find it interesting when things that used to be basically an underground topic, and it certainly was in the context of the Manosphere, go mainstream, because obviously they have to then more or less accord with the linguistic expectations, if you will, of the masses. And basically that means it needs to sound right and you need to present things in the right way. And so one of the topics I found interesting is the topic about the various symmetries and asymmetries that exist between men and women. Obviously, I've always found that topic interesting, talked a lot about it on this channel, but how the mainstream has picked up on it. Namely, that both sexes are, as it were, suffering from their own problems in the so-called mating crisis, but one tendency I always see, and this goes back to just basically human nature, is the tendency to always look at a problem that exists between men and women and try to, even if men honestly have it a little bit worse or even far worse, equalize that problem in order to make it seem that women actually have it just as bad, if not worse. Now, I'm not really interested in so-called oppression Olympics, but I think it is important to point out here, namely that the male situation is actually not symmetrical with the female situation. Men obviously are very different from women, and women are very different from men. But here's the way it goes. You'll hear this frequently. And this point of view is best encapsulated, I think, by the evolutionary psychologist William Costello, who will use the pizza analogy, right? The idea being that men like pizza. Pizza is good. It tastes good. But there's really good pizza and there's pizza. But they're all pretty good. Whereas for women, not all pizza is good. There's only really good pizza. And so his argument, and the argument of many people, is that women are so picky and so choosy that effectively, even if they're awash in a surfeit of options and partners, romantically speaking, that if they're not really interested in any of them, or in the vast majority of them, because they're so picky, that is somehow the equivalent of a man with absolutely no options, living in total isolation, no social contacts, etc., etc. That's just as bad. Now, I don't actually know if you can prove that one way or the other, because I'm not a clairvoyant. I'm also not Charles Xavier, i.e. I'm not a telepath. I cannot read thoughts. It might be the case that, for all I know, women suffer tremendous anguish from having dozens of options, none of which they deem good, versus a man who has literally zero options. But let's set aside matters of telepathy here and talk about the actual situation on the ground. The reality is that, as bad as that might be, theoretically, it just doesn't add up. It's not as bad as the equivalent. So, for example, I have a female acquaintance who, in this instance, actually acknowledges the reason why she was saved was because she was female, who managed to find a guy with a decent amount of money, and now she's set. She acknowledges this would not happen to a man. Now, it happens to be the case that she actually likes the guy, as far as I'm aware. But another way of looking at it, imagine the idea of a man starving out in the street, no food, so he's starving to death, and the woman is limited to eating gruel and potatoes, right? So it's not amazing, but what's better, starving to death on the street or consuming gruel and potatoes? I don't think, really, the level of social isolation, increasingly, that men experience and feel, not having access to romantic partners, but even more importantly, even to friends, something that's rare with women, it does happen, but it's rare, is somehow equivalent in any way, shape, or form. I think this is yet another attempt to try to make us feel a certain sympathy, empathy, and understand women and prioritize them over male wants and needs and even concern. So if you're to say, yeah, it really sucks if a guy has no friends, no partners, poor familial ties. And then you come around and say women are so picky that despite having good friends, good family connections, she only has 20 choices that she's not too enamored of. That simply is not equivalent. But obviously, at the end of the day, we all kind of exist in our headspace. And so in some sense, I kind of get it. But it seems to me that despite people's awareness, the mainstream, that is, and people who are adjacent to the mainstream, of the quote-unquote mating crisis and the trials and tribulations of men, increasingly young men, even if it's seen as a problem, it always is reframed as a problem for women. Now, people take issue with the use of the term gynocentric. I get it. And sometimes it might be overused or used inappropriately. But when you try to reframe an issue that's primarily affecting men, social isolation, and an inability to find partners, and again, just in general, not many friends, well, that's actually the same thing as women having a whole bunch of options but not being totally enamored of all of them. You try to reframe a male issue as a female issue. You try to make it equivalent. And why do we do that? Well, isn't it obvious? Because we always need to feel either an overweening sympathy for women or we need to be forced to, even when it's not necessarily that appropriate. Sure, I get it. Women can't help how picky they are. But nonetheless, if a woman can find some guy that's going to take care of her and she's going to have an okay life, that's better than working some dead-end job, not having any friends, no romantic prospects, etc., etc. There's just no way you can compare the two. Now, in the Manosphere, and this is a bit of a meme, but it's true, sometimes this is referred to as women most affected, right? I mean, you see this constantly. This is kind of a perennial truth, as it were, right? You'll see some article published in a newspaper, maybe it appears online. It'll say something to the effect of 25% of homeless are women in this city. Obviously meant to grab your attention and think, oh, wow, that's a lot of homeless women, neglecting the 75% that are men. So we play this game all the time, and frankly, I'm deeply skeptical that the people who claim they want to help men really do want to help men. We're always going to be in a situation where overwhelmingly women are granted more sympathy, more understanding, etc., than are men. And I simply don't see that changing anytime soon. And this reframing of the mating crisis as being, quote-unquote, just as bad for women because they're really picky, again, I'm not in women's heads, and I'm not a telepath. It just beggars belief. Because at the end of the day, if you can be in an okay-ish situation romantically, and maybe you're not thrilled with it, isn't that better than having absolutely nothing? It's true that it's not always the case that the presence of something is better than its absence. But in this case, as long as you get along decently enough, I think it's very much true. A good example of what I'm talking about here is how the whole university college, quote-unquote, crisis is being framed, right? Not enough men are going to college, so it's a problem for women. Not a problem for the men. Assuming college education is the best thing you can do, I mean, that's a separate discussion. Let's say for the sake of argument it is. Not enough men are going to college. Okay. So the question arises, is that bad for the men? No, it's bad for the women. Because women can't then find educated enough partners to satisfy their hypergamy. The men who are potentially, by light of this argumentation, missing out on opportunities, etc., they're, I don't know, chopped liver. So you see this framing again and again and again. So for all the time that's passed, nothing has really changed in terms of the framework of our language and how we decide to engage with these topics, at least in the mainstream. And I suspect it will remain so. And I want to come to a final point here, probably the most important point I can make here, and that is if you want to engender sympathy for women, ignoring men's problems, pretending that they're either exactly equivalent or not as bad, that's not a good way of going about it. You can't expect men to be deeply sympathetic to women, at least men who are aware of their actual situation, and to worry about women and womankind when their own problems are being blatantly ignored. In the simplest of terms, if you have a dog and you mistreat it and kick it all the time, It's either going to become aggressive or run away from you. It's not going to think that you're a great owner, right? Now, it's not the best analogy necessarily, but you can't keep on ignoring men's problems and reframing it as a female problem and then say, why aren't you sympathetic to women? I find it entirely understandable when men tell me, and there are many such men, they are not in a position to sympathize with women. Why should they? When their own suffering is ignored, when their own issues are ignored, and inasmuch as these things are even addressed, they're just reframed as a female issue. I think it's important to make this point. It's probably the most salient point I can make, because things are not going to change, and attitudes towards women are not going to change, at least in certain circles, unless proper attention is paid to issues that men face, and they aren't reframed through the lens of the feminine, whether they do that intentionally or not. Anyway, as always, thank you for tuning in. Special thanks to my patrons who support the channel. You guys are the best. You keep the channel alive. And all that YouTube jazz. Comment, like, subscribe, share. And if I'm still alive, I will check you out later. Until next time, may the gods watch over you. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.